June 15, 1944. The atmosphere inside 10 Downing Street in London was suffocating. It had been exactly 9 days since the world watched the horizon of Normandy, filled with the greatest armada in human history. But behind the maps and the heroic radio broadcasts, the reality was grim. The Allied forces were struggling. The breakout from the beachheads was moving at a crawl, and the casualty lists were growing longer with every passing hour. Inside his private study, Prime Minister Winston Churchill sat enveloped in a thick cloud of cigar smoke. Across from him sat General Dwight Eisenhower, the Supreme Allied Commander, looking every bit as exhausted as the men in the foxholes. Churchill took a slow sip of his brandy and looked at Eisenhower with a piercing gaze. He began by stating that they needed to discuss a rather delicate matter. Eisenhower immediately felt a wave of tension. He knew that tone. Whenever Churchill spoke of delicate matters, it usually meant a plan so complex and politically risky that it could either win the war or cause a total collapse of command. When Eisenhower asked what kind of matter, Churchill dropped the name that always caused a stir: General George S. Patton. Eisenhower tensed up instantly. He asked what George had done now. At that moment, Patton was the commander of a phantom. He was leading the fictitious First US Army Group, a ghost army designed to trick the Germans into thinking the main invasion would hit Calais. It was working brilliantly. German reserves were frozen, waiting for a threat that didn't exist while the real war was happening in Normandy. But Churchill was restless. He proposed something radical. He wanted to send Patton to France, give him the real Third Army, and let him loose across Brittany. However, there was a psychological twist that only Churchill could conceive. He wanted to keep using Patton as bait. He explained that the Germans feared Patton more than any other Allied commander. They were obsessed with him. Churchill's plan was to activate Patton for real, but to make the German intelligence believe that his actions in France were merely a diversion, a clever trick to draw their forces away from the real invasion still supposedly coming to Calais. Eisenhower stared at him in disbelief. He realized Churchill wanted to use Patton as double reverse bait. Patton would be real, but the Germans would be led to think he was fake, which in turn would make them believe the fake army in England was the real one. Eisenhower struggled to find the words. He pointed out that this required Patton to fight real, bloody battles while simultaneously pretending they weren't important. He asked Churchill if he had truly considered who George Patton was. Patton lived for glory. He lived for the headlines and the recognition of his genius. Asking George Patton to win a battle quietly, Eisenhower remarked, was like asking a peacock to hide its feathers. It went against his very soul. Yet, the strategic value was undeniable. Eisenhower finished his drink in one gulp and muttered that this was either going to be a disaster or a stroke of absolute brilliance. This is the untold story of one of the most complex deception operations of the Second World War. It is the story of how the Allies used their most aggressive general as both a lethal weapon and a silent decoy, and how the struggle to manage Patton's massive ego nearly drove the Allied high command to the brink of insanity. Before the first boots hit the sand on June 6, Operation Fortitude had already set the stage. The Allies had built an entire world of fiction: fake radio traffic, inflatable rubber tanks, and empty barracks. The centerpiece of this lie was Patton. The German high command believed Patton was the best the Allies had. They concluded that wherever Patton was, the main blow would fall, because Patton was seen in southeastern England. Hitler remained convinced that Normandy was just a feint. Even after D-Day, thousands of German soldiers stayed in Calais, waiting for Patton's ghost army, while their comrades were being overwhelmed in the south. But by June 7th, Patton was reaching a breaking point. While his friends Omar Bradley and Bernard Montgomery were commanding vast armies and making history, Patton was sitting in a headquarters in Dover, commanding a collection of rubber decoys and fake radio operators. He called Eisenhower, exploding with frustration. He told Ike he was tired of play acting. He felt like a prop, a wooden dummy, a scarecrow designed to frighten the Germans while the real war passed him by. Eisenhower tried to calm him, telling him he was more valuable as a deception than a commander. But Patton was inconsolable. He was a warrior without a war, and the silence was killing him. On June 10th, Churchill met with his planners to finalize the extension of this lie. He argued that even after the breakout, they must keep the Germans uncertain. He proposed that once the Third Army was activated, its successes should be downplayed. The German generals would see Patton moving through Brittany and think, this is the distraction. He is trying to pull us away from the main strike at Calais. It was a psychological trap. Churchill knew that the more successful Patton was, the more the Germans might believe it was a ruse. The logic was so inverted it was dizzying. When the time came for Eisenhower to explain this to Patton on June 16, he dreaded it. Patton arrived suspicious when he heard he was getting the Third Army and heading to France. His face lit up with the predatory joy of a hunter. But then the hammer dropped. Eisenhower explained that he had to operate quietly. He told Patton to let the press focus on others, to keep his objectives vague, and to allow the world to think his campaign was a secondary sideshow. Patton's reaction was a mix of bitter laughter and pure rage. He asked Eisenhower if he truly understood what he was asking. To capture cities and act like they didn't matter. To win the fastest campaign in history and stay out of the newspapers. He felt it was a humiliation. He accused the high command of wanting Montgomery to take the credit for his blood and sweat. Eisenhower had to be firm. He told Patton that his ego was not more important than ending the war. He told him that every German division kept at Calais was a division. They didn't have to kill in Normandy. Patton silenced himself. He agreed, but he warned Eisenhower, "I can control my tongue, but I cannot control how loudly I win." On July 28, 1944, the Third Army was finally unleashed. What followed was a whirlwind of violence and speed. Patton's tanks raced 30 miles in a single day, then 50. They tore through the German lines, pouring into Brittany like a flood. In the war rooms, intelligence officers watched the German reaction with bated breath. The Germans were paralyzed. They saw Patton, but they couldn't believe his success was the main effort. The deception was holding. However, the press problem began almost immediately. Reporters were desperate for a quote from the blood and guts general. On August 2nd, Patton stood before a crowd of journalists. Every instinct in his body wanted to scream his triumph to the world. But he remembered his promise. When asked if this was the main offensive, he forced himself to be diplomatic. He talked about supporting roles and assigned missions. He gave credit to Montgomery and Bradley. He looked into the cameras and lied for the sake of the strategy, and according to his aides. It nearly made him sick to his stomach. He felt he was betraying his men by not shouting their glory from the rooftops. By August 15th, the situation shifted. The German retreat had turned into a chaotic rout. Patton saw an opening to pivot east, toward Paris and the heart of Germany. He called Eisenhower and told him that Brittany was now a dead end. The real war was to the east. Eisenhower realized that the time for games was over. He gave the order to pivot. The deception was officially ended. Patton was no longer bait, he was the spearhead. When Churchill heard of the Third Army's progress, he was ecstatic. He recognized that Patton had done the impossible. He had played the part of a humble subordinate just long enough to keep the Germans confused. For 2 crucial weeks, those 2 weeks allowed the Allies to solidify their hold on France, and likely saved tens of thousands of lives. Churchill noted that Patton was like a great stage actor forced to perform for an empty house. He was brilliant, but he desperately needed the applause. In the months that followed, Patton finally got his headlines. He was on the cover of Time magazine. He was the hero of the American public. But in his private moments, he never forgot the cost of the quiet weeks. He told reporters later that winning battles while pretending they weren't important was the hardest thing he had ever done. He admitted that fighting the Germans was easy, but fighting his own ego was the hardest battle of the entire war. Historians now look back at the Churchill-Eisenhower-Patton collaboration as a rare moment of strategic harmony between 3 impossible men. Churchill provided the grand, complex vision. Eisenhower provided the diplomatic glue that kept the generals from killing each other. And Patton provided the raw, unstoppable tactical power. They were 3 men who didn't always like each other, and who certainly didn't understand each other's temperaments. But they worked together to create a masterpiece of military history. The double reverse bait remains a testament to the fact that wars are won, not just with bullets and tanks, but with the psychological manipulation of the enemy's mind. Patton's Third Army didn't just break the German lines, it broke the German command's ability to trust their own intelligence. And at the center of it all was a general who had to learn that sometimes the greatest service a warrior can provide is to win his greatest victory in total silence. It was a plan that shouldn't have worked, a plan that relied on the discipline of an undisciplined man. But against all odds, it became the brilliant, bloody reality that liberated a continent. The decision to pivot east in August 1944 was not merely a tactical change, it was the moment. The world finally saw the true face of the Third Army. But to understand the weight of that moment, we must look at the agonizing days leading up to its days when Patton was forced to be a ghost, while his men were dying in the hedgerows of France. While the official history books often focus on the grand maps of Normandy, the real story lived in the frantic, coded messages between the German Oberkommando der Wehrmacht Acque and their field commanders. Even as Patton's tanks were crushing German rearguards in Brittany, the Nazi intelligence officers were arguing in their bunkers. They looked at the reports of Patton's speed and said, "It's too fast. It's too aggressive. This must be the lure." Churchill's psychological trap had created a feedback loop of paranoia. The more brilliant Patton's maneuvers became, the more convinced the Germans were that he was merely a distraction from a much larger, darker threat still sitting across the English Channel. In the mud of Brittany, the reality was far from a game. Patton's soldiers, often overlooked in the grand shadow of the D-Day veterans, were performing military miracles. They were covering ground at a pace that hadn't been seen since the German Blitzkrieg of 1940. They were capturing thousands of prisoners and liberating towns before the local resistance even knew they had arrived. Yet, because of the quiet orders from Eisenhower, these men were not getting the recognition they deserved. Patton felt this sting personally. In his private diary, he wrote about the treachery of silence. He believed that a soldier's morale was fueled by the pride of his nation. To keep his men's achievements out of the headlines was, in his mind, a crime against his troops. This created a secondary battle won between Patton's loyalty to the mission and his love for his soldiers. He spent his nights pacing his mobile headquarters, a converted bus he called the Palace, drinking scotch and cursing the politicians in uniform back in London, who demanded he win without a sound. The press conference on August 2nd remains one of the most tense moments in the history of military media relations. When Patton stood before those reporters, he wasn't just representing the U.S. Army, he was acting as a high-stakes poker player. Every word was measured, every boast was suppressed. For a man who famously said, "I don't want to get any messages saying that we are holding our position," being forced to play the role of a secondary support element was a spiritual torture. He had to sit by and watch as Bernard Montgomery, a man Patton viewed as overly cautious and slow, received the lion's share of the glory. But the strategy of strategic ambiguity was paying dividends that could only be measured in blood not spilled. Historians estimate that by keeping the German 15th Army tied down at Calais for those extra weeks, the Allies prevented at least 5 elite panzer divisions from reinforcing the Normandy front. If those tanks had reached the beachhead in June or July, the breakout might never have happened. The war could have dragged on into 1946, or worse, ended in a stalemate. When the pivot finally came on August 15th, it was like a dam breaking. Eisenhower's order to unleash Patton was more than just a change in direction, it was an admission that the deception had done its job. The Germans finally realized that the ghost was real, but by then, it was too late. The Third Army was no longer a threat on a map, it was a steel fist at their throat. Patton's dash toward the Seine River and the liberation of Paris became the stuff of legend. The peacock had finally been allowed to show his feathers, and they were stained with the dust of 100 French villages. Post-war analysis by German generals like Gerd von Rundstedt confirmed the success of Churchill's gambit. In his interrogations, Rundstedt admitted that the German high command was obsessed with Patton. They studied his past campaigns in North Africa and Sicily. They believed they understood him. They thought his ego would never allow him to be part of a deception. By using Patton's own personality against the enemy, Churchill and Eisenhower had performed a judo throw of military intelligence, using the enemy's own weight and expectations to trip them. In the final assessment, the story of Patton as Bade is a reminder that the greatest leaders are those who can sacrifice their own desires for the sake of the collective goal. Eisenhower had to sacrifice his peace of mind to manage Patton. Churchill had to sacrifice his traditional views of warfare to embrace the black arts of deception. And Patton had to sacrifice the thing he loved most, public glory, to ensure that the war was won as quickly as possible. Today, when we visit the graves at Colville-sur-Mer or the monuments in Brittany, we see the names of the men who fought, but behind those names is the invisible hand of a deception that worked because 3 very different men found a way to bridge the gap between genius and madness. The "You want me to do what with Patton?" conversation wasn't just a funny anecdote from a smoke-filled room, it was the birth of a strategy that broke the back of the Third Reich. It proves that in the theater of war, the most important actor isn't always the one with the loudest voice. Sometimes, it's the one who is willing to stay in the shadows just long enough to deliver the final killing blow. Patton, the man who wanted to be the hero of every story, eventually understood this. His silence in the summer of 1944 was his most profound contribution to the world's freedom. It was his hardest battle, his most difficult victory, and perhaps his finest hour.